They soared together for 8 years on Indianapolis Afternoon Sports Talk Radio. Jake Query and Derek Schultz did. Then a bumpy and unexpected landing. Corporate pulled the plug in 2020. No more Query and Schultz on radio.
Hi, I'm Query.
And I'm Schultz.
And of course, we do the incredibly creatively and appropriately named Query and Schultz program every Monday on ISC Sports Network.
Derek Schultz, growing up as a miracle triplet, his journey from the wiffleball fields of the East Coast to life now in Indiana, and how jumping on a trampoline with his young son helped him bounce back from losing his radio gig. He's my guest this week on the Business and Beyond podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 85 of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. I'm Gary Dick. Derek Schultz grew up just outside of New York City in Trumbull, Connecticut. He was the first of 3 children Dorothy Schultz gave birth to, all in one delivery. Triplets, or miracle triplets as Derek describes it. He grew up a sports junkie, told his mom as a 6-year-old he wanted to be a sportscaster. He loved basketball and started a wiffle ball league with his buddies as a teenager. Once Derek realized playing sports in high school or college wasn't in the cards, he set his sights on covering them. Graduated IU, went on to a successful career in sports radio, co-hosting Query and Schultz on WNDE for 8 years, and now on ISC Sports Network with his broadcasting buddy, Jake Query. And it really gives me a great deal of pleasure to be joined by Derek Schultz, the currently content and communications manager at ISC Sports Network. You also catch him every week with his buddy Jake Query on ISC Sports Network and across major podcast platforms as well with that show. Derek, how are you?
It's great to hear from you, Gary. I always feel underdressed every time that we interact at all. But thanks so much for having me on your show.
We are good. You know, this is as I was driving in this morning, thinking about our conversation, and there are several really kind of great times to be a sports fan. I think this is one of them as we get into the fall. We've got college football starting up. As we are taping this now, the Colts will open up this weekend, so the NFL season's getting underway. Major League Baseball will soon be in playoff mode. So a lot going on in the sports world.
Yeah, you have kind of everything sort of converging at once over these next couple of weeks, because even when you get into October, then the Pacers start camp, and Hoosier hysteria and Mackey Madness, Indiana, Purdue, college basketball right around the corner. It really is one of my favorite times of the year. But specifically when it comes to the Colts here in this town, it's kind of one of those hope springs eternal sort of thing.
Right.
This is a different market. This isn't Chicago. This isn't New York, where it's a lot of doom and gloom and the fans are calling in to complain. This is a lot of, hey, how do we get to the Super Bowl this year type stuff every single year with this team.
Well, okay, speaking of the Super Bowl, or at least the playoffs or a run in the playoffs, realistically speaking, from your standpoint, there is some optimism this year. I know I talked to Frank Reich on the podcast a few weeks ago, and of course he's going to say that, but he talked about an optimism and enthusiasm that he is feeling. Obviously a new quarterback in Matt Ryan. The Colts have made a few moves. They seem to have pieces in place to have a pretty good season. Is that an overstatement?
No, I think they absolutely have the pieces in place to have a good season. You're still relying on a lot of different things hitting, including some unknowns, like let's say at wide receiver with Paris Campbell, who is talented but has never shown himself to be healthy. Stephon Gilmore, who was the defensive player of the year a couple of years ago as a lockdown cornerback, now trying to kind of revive his career, who's also had some health concerns in Indianapolis. Unique Ngakwe's been a great player, a really nice, solid pass rusher, but for some reason he's bounced around to like 5 different teams and no one seems to know why. So, there are a lot of unknowns and you could say that about the other 31 NFL teams too. But if certain things hit, then this team can really go somewhere. But Gary, to me, I think it's very important that the Colts win something tangible this season. They haven't won the division since 2014. That's an awful long time to go, especially when, if we're being honest, this is historically the NFL's worst division, at least since the last realignment 20 years ago, which is hard to believe that it's been 20 years, right, of the AFC South. But I think deep down, Frank Reich, who is entering year 5, and Chris Ballard, who is entering year 6, know that, okay, it's time to shift this thing into drive after kind of spinning their wheels these last couple of years.
When they announced the deal to get Matt Ryan, I thought it was a heck of a deal. I mean, I thought it was a really a positive for the Colts. Not everyone nationally, maybe some locally, there were folks who questioned that. What's your take on Matt Ryan? I think he's a great fit for this franchise, obviously at the tail end of his career, but a leader, a guy who's been there, was, close to a Super Bowl win. What's your take on Matt Ryan and what his impact will be this season?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. From the Colts standpoint, they really got lucky that it worked out this way, because they pushed their chips in on a losing hand, which was the Carson Wentz experiment last year. And a lot of times it's hard to recover from something like that, but the Colts were able to recoup something out of Wentz from Washington and then parlay just a later round pick into Matt Ryan, who isn't the player that he was when he went to the Super Bowl, as you said, Gary, as an MVP in 2016 and had the Falcons that close to winning that thing, up 28-3 at one point. But still, I think raises the floor of what the Colts have had at quarterback with guys like Carson Wentz and with guys like Jacoby Brissett. I don't think that he is going to struggle the way that those guys struggle. I think he brings a stability, leadership. There are a lot of similarities to me, even though he is a lesser player. And I think even he'd admit that, a lesser player than Peyton Manning. I think there are a lot of similarities between him and Peyton Manning and how he approaches things, and no nonsense, no excuses, prepare, practice. And I think you're going to see a lot of the same rituals and routines that you saw when Manning was here. I think what fans want to see is maybe some of the same results as when Manning was here, but that is still TBD.
What's Derek Schultz been up to? I look at your career and certainly followed you and listened to you frequently. You and Jay Query on the show on NDE for so many years. And you really developed a strong following. And I think, and we'll get into that and how that all played out. But, I look at you and you seem to be continuing to reinvent yourself, doing a number of really cool things. I know Indianapolis Monthly is one. Mentioned the ISC Sports Network as well. Tell me what's keeping you busy.
Yeah, a lot of stuff is keeping me busy, including a very active kindergartner. But certainly in my professional life as well. It was an interesting time for me, because when iHeart had the national layoffs and we got swept up in that. They cut 1,000 jobs and it hit the middle markets especially pretty bad. Louisville and Des Moines and obviously Indianapolis with Jake and I, and we lost I think 8 other people in our building on that day. But at that time, I just didn't really know what I was going to do. Radio was the only thing that I had ever done and what I was passionate about. And honestly, with my contract, that was essentially what I was restricted in doing. I was only going to do this and only going to be this radio host. And then, COVID hit, and my wife being a trauma ICU nurse at a city hospital, like there were a lot of things kind of converging at once at that time. It was not that 2020 wasn't a trying year for just about everybody. I'm just saying that, kind of in my world, it was, job loss into the pandemic, into, what am I going to do? The avalanche of all of that kind of happening at once. But what I thought to myself was, look, today's landscape, I'm not going to sit around and wait for a radio job. I'm not going to sit around and wait for a sports media job. That is shrinking. It's not expanding. Those seats are going away compared to where they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So how can I stay in this, and how can I stay involved, and how can I keep building on the foundation that Jake and I, and I guess myself as well, have already built on with this brand and everything like that, while still kind of fulfilling my professional obligations and, helping contribute to the household and having a job, really. And so it's really just worked out really well, Gary. My 9 to 5, if you will, my day job is what you mentioned there with the IC Sports Network, which is more behind the scenes, which I'm fine with, talking with athletic directors and being kind of the point of contact for our productions and helping staff those and put all of that stuff together in social media and all of that stuff. But it's allowed me the freedom to pursue these other things. A quick story on the Indy Monthly thing. they actually approached me at the end of I had a non-compete, which I think people in the business know, but I think people outside the business don't realize that even if they let you go, they still hold you to a non-compete.
Yep.
So it's August of 2020, and Michael Rubino, who's the editor-in-chief at Indianapolis Monthly, was like, hey, and I had done a couple of things with Indy Monthly sort of over the years, just, we had kind of a relationship or whatever. Do you want to write about your sabbatical? You're 6 months away and what you've been doing. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know if I want to do that because it was a really challenging time for me from a mental standpoint and, kind of recalibrating who I was as a professional and as a dad. And I took a job at Amazon part-time because I just needed to I told my wife, I was like, I started busting tables when I was 15. I've never really not worked. And so, I was collecting severance and all of that. But after about 4 weeks of sitting around, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I got to go somewhere and do something. So I had that experience. I also had the misfortune of scheduling a vasectomy on the day that Rudy Gobert tested positive for COVID. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to get snipped and do the frozen peas and watch basketball all day. And of course, I'm the idiot who gets it done the day that the sports world completely shuts down.
Right. Yeah.
So I thought to myself, okay, well, I'll write about this. And I had some like journal entries and things like that just to kind of, cope with what was going on. So I wrote some stuff down in March and April and May during this sabbatical, if you want to call it that. And I said, okay, to not keep it like too dark or depressing or whatever I'm talking about, I'll just kind of do a play on my journal entries and go, week by week, month by month, and also get in all these vasectomy sort of references in the piece. So that was the first thing that I did for Indy Monthly, where I just kind of wrote like, January 14th, we were let go. March 17th, this happened, March 20th, this happened. And the response was just overwhelming. I mean, it was amazing. I loved kind of opening myself up for that, but then hearing from people who were like, hey, I went through a similar thing and connecting with those people, it was great. And I think we were all kind of in it and going through it together in 2020, which feels like a long time ago now, but that's kind of how that started. And then the Indy Star, I was doing a podcast with Greg Doyle. And then he decided to kind of focus more on writing. He just kind of got, I think, burned out with everything. Greg's an extremely hard worker who I've got a tremendous amount of respect for. And so when that podcast ended, I was like, oh, okay, well, Indy Star's not going to want me to do anything anymore. I'm not with Greg. But Nat Newell calls me the next day and he's like, hey, do you have an episode for this week? It's like, what are you talking about, man? Like Greg told you, right? He's not doing it anymore. He's like, well, yeah, you could still do it. Like you host.
Yeah.
So that became kind of the Schultz Star Show podcast. And, I don't know how you feel about your show, but the number one thing I miss about being on the radio is interviewing and talking to people. And so that kind of scratches that itch for me. So it's the best of both worlds. I have the ISC job that is the job, which I still very much enjoy, but I fuel the passions with all the freelance stuff and Query and Schultz keeping that alive and Indy Monthly and Indy Star. Yeah,
you mentioned the Indy Monthly piece, which I read, and it was very interesting. And you really kind of brought readers in on that. Reflecting back, because as you mentioned, you and Derek were caught up in a nationwide cutback. So it was nothing you guys did, but going through that, talk about that the day you found out and kind of the emotions and the mental piece of that as that first hit and dealing with that. How tough was that?
So I was actually on that day, that morning, I went down to the Star headquarters downtown to tape the podcast with Greg. And I'm driving to the iHeart studios, which are in the Bob and Tom building over there, Fall Creek and Shaylin. People know about that. It's been around for a long time. It's kind of hidden back there, but it's been around for a long time. And I think it was on 465 heading back from downtown. And I get a call from Jake. And, it's like 9:30 in the morning. So I'm thinking to myself, Jake's usually not even awake yet at 9:30 in the morning. So maybe something's up here. And I answer the phone, hello. And the first thing he says is, "Are you fired?" And I said, no, I don't think so. What are you talking about? And he said, well, I'm fired. So I think you're probably fired too.
Yeah.
And so we, talked about it. He got the phone call. He actually got the heads up earlier that day. I did notice that the social media accounts passwords has changed, and I had the email on there. And so, but that had happened before, Gary, you know what I mean? Like where they've changed passwords or, they replaced a website person or whatever else. So I didn't really think of it, but then I was adding it up in my head. So that was the longest drive of my life, because it was almost like, do I even want to pull into the station knowing what they're about to tell me?
Right.
Or do I just want to stay in my car and hold on to that dream? So they brought me back in the office. My two bosses couldn't have been nicer about it. Like I said, it was not their decision. They've been through it before. They hand you the sheet of paper. Here's the severance. Here are the contacts for the company, whatever else. And then you go home. So I went home, told my wife, told my parents, and then was in a little bit of a daze. I don't think I slept or ate for about 3 days. But then I was down in my basement with my then toddler. I mean, he would have been not even 3 years old yet. And we're jumping on his little trampoline down in the basement. And we're playing this game where we have these plastic cowboy hats, and you jump until the plastic hat falls off. And we kept doing it over and over again. And here I am kind of feeling sorry for myself all week. And he's just laughing uproariously at the plastic hat falling off. And it just kind of hit me that, you know what, everything's going to be okay. You have this little happy boy that your whole life revolves around. Yeah, you're not on the AM radio anymore. Who cares? So, a lot of people said it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to you, and everything's going to be work out. I remember thinking to myself, I got to the point where I wanted to punch everyone in the face that said everything's going to be fine. Right. Because I just heard it so much. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, my career is over and I'm finished forever. And it really is, I can't speak for everybody, but most of the people seemingly that went through the same situation that I did came out the other side changed for the better. And even in some cases, including mine, in a better situation than they were beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about this convergence of things that made that period of time so challenging on multiple fronts, be it COVID or a number of other things. You guys had the chance, or it looked like you had the opportunity to come back on the air, right? You, as I read that piece, you and Jake met with your bosses. It looked like there was a deal to come back. Tell me about that.
So it was the same day actually that the vasectomy was scheduled for. Later that day, our market manager really worked hard at trying to bring us back as freelancers. So it would have looked a lot different. It would not have been our employee, 401k, health benefits and all that. But he was like, look, I know this is a dead stick without a local show. So we need to have something local, and we want you guys, can we do a revenue share? And ran it up the flagpole and eventually came back with a deal where we were going to come back and essentially split things. And there were some other things that were involved in that. I'm not going to get into like the minutia of all of it, but there was a deal on the table for that to happen. I'm not 100% sure that it was not a guarantee, Gary, that we were going to take that deal. I was ready to leave it behind. Like I said, I was during that time, I was thinking about, and this because I reached out to you about this. I was looking at guys like Dick Ray and Eric Halverson and Mark Alesia, who had moved out of media and gotten into communications or PR and had done very well for themselves. And I thought, okay, where do my skills translate? I think I can do that. And I was ready to kind of leave it behind full time. But that deal was on the table. And then obviously COVID changed the equation. A couple of weeks later, I had called back and been like, hey, so about that deal, I'm assuming that's off. And the bosses were like, look, we can't do it. We've got to, they're taking on water. They had to focus on the boats that they already had in their fleet. They couldn't add another one there. So that deal, I don't think that deal was ever meant to be, honestly, but yes, that just adding to the calamity and the craziness of that day, that's what I wrote about in Indy Monthly, that actually happened on the same day as the procedure.
Well, hey, what's your take on the state of radio? Obviously, all media is changing and continues to change in a big way, but radio nationally, but certainly here locally, we saw the recent acquisition of Emmis and what that might hold. We'll see. But what's your take on that? And I look at WNDE as an example. You guys go off. There's not a local component there, right? I mean, there's nothing local. I don't know what the business model is there. But anyway, your overall take on the radio business.
I think you're just having a bunch of, like, Milwaukee just did this where they gassed out their entire sports staff, and it's just a dead stick. They put on a national satellite, whatever, and it rolls through, and maybe there's some local play-by-play here and there that they sprinkle in, but that's essentially it. And if they show up in the ratings book at all, it's, somewhere in the 20s or the 30s, if they're lucky. So sadly, that's kind of where a lot of those, and I'm not saying that to be like, vengeful. I don't have any ill will towards, I loved my time there, changed my life, but I think that's where it's at. I am a little bit biased here because, like I said, radio is my passion, and it always will be. It's my first love, and nothing will ever change that. I think there'll always be a place for that. Podcasting has made things a little bit different, but there's this like kind of general store aspect of sports radio. Podcast is so hyper specific. Like, I'm going to listen to the Colts podcast and it's only about the Colts, or I'm going to listen to this podcast about, Ulysses Grant and it's only about that. Whereas what I always kind of liked about, at least with Jake and me, or even like JMV, or use a local example here, Jake's new show with Newish Show with Kevin Bowen, is that it's a little bit of everything, right? Not only is it Colts, it's Pacers, it's IU, it's Purdue. And it's also, hey, I went to the Rivy the other day and this is what happened to me. You know what I mean? It connects with people that I don't think you can necessarily get all the, sure, podcasts connect with people too, but more kind of far reaching and more, you're grabbing more ears and more eyeballs with that sort of content. So I think there'll always be a place for that. But I think where we're going is that, when I was coming out of school, Gary, in 2005, it was like, pick a lane. Do you want to do print? Do you want to do radio? Do you want to do TV? And now you have to be able to do all of those things. You have to be able to be on camera. You have to be able to write, and you have to be able to talk. And you're not going to be successful if you're not able to do all three of those things. But also, you don't need to attach yourself to a platform. You have a platform in your pocket right now.
Right.
So, anybody can get on YouTube and do a show, or anybody can start a podcast and kind of do a show. So I think where we're heading, and this is an extreme example, but look at Pat McAfee. Pat McAfee is involved. Well, now he's with ESPN College Game Day, right? But WWE, and then he's got his own show, and then he's got his separate deals with FanDuel and stuff like that. But it's all him. It's all his. He has the freedom to bounce around and do kind of whatever he wants to do. And I think that's where we're going. Like, I don't know if 20 years from now, even if there is a sports radio host in midday or afternoon drive in a major market, if that person is collecting a 401k and an employee of some company, I wonder if that's just going to be freelance, where you're sharing your platform with somebody else. That's where ultimately, when I look into the crystal ball, that's where I think it's going.
Much more with Derek Schultz coming up when we return. We'll talk about Derek, the early years in Connecticut, what brought him to Indiana University, and a whole lot more. The Miracle Twins as well. We'll certainly talk about that. Or triplets, right?
Triplets, that's right.
I said twins. Boy, the Miracle Triplets. We'll talk about that too when the Business and Beyond podcast continues.
This is Alex Brown. Get caught up on the state's top business news every business day with Inside Indiana Business Radio on demand. This twice-daily podcast features our statewide Inside Indiana Business Radio reports with additional bonus content that you can listen to anytime, anywhere. You can listen now on the podcast page at InsideIndianaBusiness.com or subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week is radio icon Derek Schultz. He's currently the content and communications manager at ISC Sports Network, also the host of Query and Schultz on the ISC Sports Network. You can catch that on Comcast, Xfinity Channel 81, as well as all major podcast platforms. Also the host of Schultz's Star Show, which I had the good fortune to appear on here not long ago. Hey, Derek, let's start kind of in the early years. And I feel like, and I'm sure a lot of people who listen to the radio show feel the same way. like they know you because you would talk about and Jake would talk about stuff all the time. You're growing up in Connecticut. What was Trumbull, Connecticut, right?
Yes.
What was growing up in Connecticut like?
It was great. It was suburbia USA. It was kind of like a giant New York City suburb, essentially. Trumbull was nestled in Fairfield County, which had a lot of affluent communities around it, but Trumbull was not. Darien, New Canaan, a lot of the rich like hedge fund people that worked in New York City had homes there. Trumbull was much more kind of laid back, but I always say I had a very my childhood was like a Norman Rockwell painting. My mom sang in the church choir and my dad did everything with us. And, they're about to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary coming up this summer. My sisters and I were close and played together. We played wiffle ball and basketball and football with all the neighborhood kids. It was a wonderful place to grow up. And then every time we did anything special, we'd go into this huge metropolis in New York City and go to the Garden and see a concert or go to a Yankee game or go on Broadway or, go see the Tree when it was Christmas in Rockefeller Center. It was great. I think as an adult, I've come to kind of appreciate more that my childhood was not something that it was something that I kind of took for granted at the time because a lot of my friends had similar upbringings too. But then you come to realize, hey, not everybody had that. But my folks were born and raised in South Bend, went to Adams, class of 69. And in the 70s, my dad, with his mentor, who I'm actually named after, his name was Derek McCleary, who's still living, said, hey, you need to come out here. We've got this branch that's in Norwalk, Connecticut, which is down the road. And we want you to join up with us here. And so he and my mom moved out there. But Connecticut was, it'll always be home to me. It was a great place to grow up. And I really enjoyed my time there.
Yeah. And I forgot about the South Bend connection. That's, that's interesting. Hey, but the fact that you're in media and are making a living in media, probably not unusual because you were a media star at birth, right? In Connecticut. And I remember hearing you and Jake talk about this, but the Miracle Triplets, the local newspaper followed that miracle birth. Talk about that. You're one of three, right? One
of three. So I'm the oldest by 2 and 4 minutes. So my baby sisters are Dorothy and Abby. At the time, the story that I was always told, Gary, and I believed this up until like my 30th birthday, was that an angel came down from the sky and just handed my mom 3 babies. Turns out there were some clinical trial fertility drugs and things like that in the early 80s that were involved. And I guess it really took. And so instead of one, who my parents were just desperately trying to have a family, they ended up with, boom, instant family and all 3 of us. But, in all seriousness, we were supposed to be born in mid-May. And my mom started going into labor in mid-February.
Wow.
So we were, I think, 11 weeks premature. And there was some, thought that, there's like a 50, this is just, secondhand. Obviously, I'm in the womb. I don't know exactly what's going on, but there's this 50-50 chance that everything is going to be okay. And even if something is going to be okay, that there's not going to be some sort of complications. And thank God that there wasn't with, me and my sisters are both 3 healthy babies and now healthy adults. So we were born a little over 2 pounds each and spent the first couple of weeks in incubators before they were allowed to take us home. But the Trumbull Times, which is still around, the town paper, it's about 40,000 people in that town. So it's a decent sized little community. Had a reporter that followed us around really for the first 5 years of our life. We actually had an article from our first trip out to Indiana to see my grandparents when they were still living. And
so this has been an ongoing saga, an ongoing story, right?
That's right. What I always say is that I'm used to being in the spotlight because it literally happened from the second that I drew my first breath.
I love it. And I got to ask you about wiffle ball because that was a huge passion, right? Growing up in Connecticut.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was about 14, we had a decent sized backyard and my dad had cleared out a lot of the woods. And so we would have like home run derbies with we would use sometimes baseballs when we were kids. And then we kept hitting the house. So we started using tennis balls with aluminum bats. But then we hit it so hard. One of my buddies, Greg Larson, in fact, who lived down the street from us, hit a tennis ball so hard that it actually broke the awning or something on the back window. So my parents said, hey, you can't do this anymore. You got to find something else. So we're like, okay, well, wiffle balls aren't going to travel that far. So we started a league, and this was in the very early days. Do you remember the old, kind of like GoDaddy, the old web hosting was called Angel Fire?
Yeah.
And you could build your own website, right? So I welcome.to/TWBL. I think the homepage is actually still up. So you can see the Trumbull Wiffle Ball League website circa 1997. So it's crazy to think it's 25 years ago. And we had 4 teams, and I was a freshman in high school with some neighborhood kids and some of the kids in the freshman class at Trumbull High. And we'd play games every Saturday. And we did that for 2.5 years. The problem is that in the third year, kids were 16, 17, started bringing beer over, there were cigarette butts in the yard. And my parents said, hey, no more wiffle ball league. So that abruptly ended around when I was 16 going on 17.
I love it. Hey, what got you to IU for college?
It was really 2 things. One was my parents are both alums, and I grew up just a rabid IU basketball fan. I actually grew up before I realized how much this made people upset out here, given their ties to South Bend. My sister went to St. Mary's. I grew up a huge Notre Dame football, IU basketball, reversible jacket guy.
Okay.
And I kind of quickly left that aside once I came out here, just for on-air purposes. But IU basketball was the big draw. We'd watch all the Saturday games on CBS. And even, in the 90s, the ESPN carried a lot of their games. So yeah. I didn't have Channel 4, obviously, in Connecticut where I grew up, but I was able to see IU 6, 8, 10 times, whatever it is a year, and all their tournament games and all that. So I didn't feel that disconnected from the program. But the other thing that I wanted was I wanted a big school far away where nobody knew who I was. I just wanted a clean slate and start over. And hey, there's that guy, Derek. I don't know anything about him. Instead of, hey, there's that guy, Derek. He threw up at the 8th grade dance and had to go home. That's what I wanted. I wanted kind of that to make a new name. And Indiana checked that box for me. There aren't a lot of schools. I didn't want to go to UConn. I didn't want to.
Was that a lot of your buddies probably went to UConn?
Yeah, and to each their own, right? I don't mean this like in a negative way towards anybody that chose to do that. I didn't want to hang out with the same people I'd hung out with my entire life. I wanted to experience something new and new people and new cultures and an entirely new region of the United States. Not that I wasn't somewhat familiar with Indiana, given, we go out to South Bend basically every summer to visit grandparents and cousins and all of that. But I just wanted something new. And Indiana really did that for me.
Well, how'd you go? Okay, you graduated from IU and matriculated to Indianapolis. What was the entree into radio? Was it WXLW? Was that the first?
Actually, I did student radio throughout IU, and I originally wanted to be a play-by-play guy. I grew up idolizing Marv Albert. My dad worked for the parent company of the New York Knicks and the New York Rangers before they ended up being bought by Cablevision. And so we'd go to Knicks games all the time. And I just, I talk about my rabid IU basketball fandom. I lived and died with the 1990s Knicks, which has always been weird living here because of, like that John rivalry, Starks and Anthony Mason were my heroes, and they are the villains
for sure
here in Central Indiana. But that was the original path that I wanted to take. And then I kind of quickly realized that it was going to be difficult, a tough nut to crack. Guys like Matt Taylor and people like that, they'll tell you how difficult it is to be, right place, right time and get that done. And show hosting was just a door that kind of opened up for me. Sophomore year, I'd stuck around at IU that summer, and they said, hey, we've got this show called the Thursday Night Sports Happy Hour. Do you want to host it? And it's 1 hour. And I said, sure. And I started doing that, and just the bug bit me. I loved the long form conversations that you could have. I loved being completely honest. It had far less structure than play-by-play. And I loved how laid back it was. So I did a couple of internships in college, including my senior year. I did one when Kevin Lee was a sports director at WIBC before 1070 The Fan existed. My first internship was I was the Pacers locker room audio gopher. So I'd go in and get the sound bites for Kevin's postgame show. And it was in some Pacers fans may remember this season. The year that I did that was the fall of 2004 into 2005. So my first couple of weeks, I'm doing weekend games for the Pacers that season. And then suddenly the brawl happens in Detroit. And instead of getting audio from J.O. and Steven Jackson and Reggie Miller, I'm getting audio from Eddie Gill and John Edwards and, all these guys who aren't used to people coming up and sticking a microphone in their face. So that was an interesting year to be my first foray into Indy. But that's when I kind of fell in love with the city, because I'd be walking back from the MS studios to my car at 2 a.m. or whatever on a Saturday, walking around the circle and walking around downtown. And I was like, hey, this is cool. I never really spent any meaningful time being in Bloomington. Outside of picking up friends at the Greyhound bus station, I never really spent any meaningful time in Indianapolis. And that's when the bug kind of bit me there too. So WXLW came along when I realized that my lease wasn't up on my house yet. I graduated in Indiana, and all of I had 4 roommates who were under me. They still had another year to go. So I still had a room there. So I thought, okay, I'm not really ready to enter the real world. I'll stick around on the lease for 1 more year in Bloomington. I had a job at Outback Steakhouse where I met my wife, and I was like, I got to do something professionally speaking besides overcooked steaks. So why don't I get another internship? So I called up Greg Rakestraw, who's a dear friend and a mentor and all of that here all these years later. And he said, yeah, we have a spot for you. In fact, you can intern, but we might even have some part-time stuff for you. And I thought, oh, that's great. So after a couple of weeks of being an intern, I started doing part-time weekends there. And it was a lot of fun. 05, 06 was one of it was a lot of 60-hour weeks and all of that, but it was one of the most fun and rewarding years of my life to be down there in Bloomington and be done with school and be able to focus on radio and have some fun as well.
Really gave you a launching pad. Okay, tell me about meeting Jake Query, how you guys came together and got the show. If I remember correctly, you guys really didn't meet till you were ready to go, essentially ready to go on the air, right? Yeah, we didn't meet face to face until 48 hours before our first show. So what happened was I was at WXLW with Rake. I moved my way up part time. I started doing a high school show and then a daytime show, and then eventually I was co-hosting with Greg afternoons. And then he left to focus on TV. And so I did solo afternoon show at WXLW for 2.5 years. And, that was tough. Gary, the signal was difficult. It pointed straight south from 56th Street. So a lot of times in the donut counties, you couldn't even hear it. Right. It was the little engine that little station, because it was the ESPN affiliate. And then it lost all of that once MS decided to expand into sports. But I had gotten a heads up from somebody that had been booked on Mark Patrick's show, and Mark's been just great. And I consider him a friend too. A wonderful guy that for advice and all that. But anyway, that they were moving on. And then, Mark obviously retired, and I put in my resume and said, hey, I'm doing the afternoon show, blah, 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 blah. I'm having coffee with Buzz Casey, who was then the program director the next day. And then the next week, I didn't have a non-compete at WXLW. They never gave me one. I never signed one. So I did my last show at WXLW on Friday, and that Monday I was on the air with Jake. But the funny thing, I knew Jake a little bit because his longtime girlfriend, Shannon Walsh, is the daughter of Donnie Walsh. And Donnie was running the Knicks at the time. And so Jake would feed me little tidbits of information about trade prospects for Carmelo Anthony based on what he gleaned from Donnie at dinner, Sunday dinner at their house. So that we did have some sort of relationship there, but we were at George's Neighborhood Grill with my program director, 71st and Binford. I remember it vividly. I'm wearing this, dress shirt. I've got slacks on from the JCPenney clearance aisle because, those radio salaries, especially on those smaller stations, did not dictate much than the JCPenney clearance aisle. And I get in there and I'm waiting in that holding area, and a guy walks in with a Quebec Nordiques t-shirt on, ripped jeans, and a backwards hat. And I thought to myself, what have I done? That's my partner.
What have I signed up for here? But the rest is, I guess the rest is history. That was my first impression of Jake. And luckily, that first impression, even though while negative, it turned into a very positive relationship.
What made, in your view, as you think about it, because you guys, I think had an energy, had a connection on the air, kind of a yin and yang, back and forth that worked. I think in a big way. What made it connect, do you think, on the air? Because your personalities and backgrounds are different, and maybe that's what it is. What in your view made it click?
I think the differences are important. We never had a blueprint or anything, Gary, where we said, okay, this is what we want the show to be. I think if you manufacture it, then it comes off as not genuine.
Right.
And
Fake,
so it just kind of evolved into time over time, what it was going to be. And what I think was kind of the pillar of the show was the fact that we're almost exactly 10 years apart, which is kind of like the perfect generational gap. And it was almost like a big brother, little brother thing, where at the end of the day, we love each other and we're stuck together, but he's going to give me the hardest time possible. I'm going to give him the hardest time possible. And that's kind of what we sort of went with there. But I think people appreciated the fact that we did not take, and we still don't, we just don't take ourselves seriously at all. Sports can be very like X's and O's and like life or death. Yeah. And we never treated it that way because, if the Colts have a devastating loss, it sucks and people call in and they're depressed and all of that. But like, I'm not losing sleep over it, and neither is Jake. And, those things should not impact your mood or your life the way that they do. So I think people appreciated that it was a little more of a laid back show, but that chemistry and things like that. I mean, that took, I can't tell you how difficult it is to just airdrop two people in and say, hey, do a show.
Sure. Yeah.
That took at least 2 years. It probably wasn't even until we were well into year 3 that I felt like we kind of got our footing and knew sort of what to expect each day and how to really play off of one another.
Any on air instances you remember in particular? I know that kind of puts you on the spot because I'm sure there were a few, but as you reflect back on those times on the air, and you were on the air for a number of years, anything that stands out to you?
I mean, there are a lot of show moments certainly that stand out to me. And I hope this was one of the endearing aspects of the show. I've been told this, and I hope everybody feels this way, that this is a universal thing. But a lot of my favorite show memories are from regular callers. We had a guy named Party Man Nick.
Oh yeah.
His name was Nick Coleman, and he called the first year that we were on the show. I think we were out at the track doing the show from Gasoline Alley, and said, hey buddy, what's up? And it's just kind of a good old boy, a native West Sider. He drove like a Chrysler LeBaron that had a tape deck in it. I remember, just full of life and energy and always in a good mood. And, got to the point where we just developed a friendship with him and people would expect him to call the show. And especially month of May when that rolled around, because he'd tell all old stories about passing out at the Coke lot and not remembering where he was and in the snake pit and all of that. Sadly, Nick had throat cancer in 2015 and ended up passing away. And that show is one that I remember, just the opening that Jake hit, because Jake is just so, he has a way with words that I can't, I think I'm pretty good at what I do, especially when it comes to like tragic circumstances and things like that. Nobody is as eloquent to me as Jake. He just knows how, it just rolls off the tongue for him. It's just easy for him. So those are some of the things, just a special bond that we had with a couple of callers and listeners. I got to meet and interview Patrick Ewing at the Final Four Radio Row in San Antonio, which
I remember you talking about.
Yeah, that. Just a huge thrill for me. Kind of an out of body experience. Almost. He was my Mickey Mantle. I mean, I had like 5 or 6 of his posters in my room. He was my hero. And just kind of going back to earlier in the conversation, Gary, like, getting me through COVID and all of that, and the layoff, what I always told people was that if you would have told me when I was 12 years old that I would have been able to do this and make a living out of it and meet and talk to Patrick Ewing and interview Don Mattingly and go to a Super Bowl where my childhood team, the Giants, won in my new hometown and get on the field and scoop up some confetti and mail it back to my dad afterwards. Like, I get that it's good to have goals and to be like, okay, I want to do this and this and this. And look, like, originally I wanted to be Marv Albert, right? I fell well short of that goal, but ultimately speaking, I feel like I did it. I feel like I accomplished what I set out to do. And a lot of people don't get to say that inside and outside of this business. And I don't mean that in like an arrogant way. I just mean it like, I'm very fortunate to have the ability to have done that. I remember telling Kevin Lee was like, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to host a drive time show in a major market. And Indy might not be New York or Chicago, but considering all the sports that that we have here to be able to do that for 12 years. I feel like I checked that box, but
yeah.
I mean, it's too hard to like pinpoint all these Corey and Schultz memories because so many kind of flood to me. Sure. But I think what made that show special for me was how special it was for other people and how we wanted to make it feel like everybody was part of the show. And I hope we accomplished that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really neat too, that you've been able to do those things, have that little hiccup in the road, that little bump in the road, and be able to kind of reinvent yourself and continue to do it. And as you look at what's next, and I know you've got a little one, you've got a lot going on. So sometimes it's tough to kind of look in the front, through the windshield as to what's next. But any thoughts on what's next for Derek Schultz, continuing to grow what you're doing? I assume what are your thoughts on kind of that next adventure?
Yeah, what's next for me, Gary, is just desperately clinging on to whatever shred of relevance I still have in Indianapolis. That's no, but while I am just almost like a obsessive compulsive prepper and planner when it comes to like show prep and really anything that I'm doing, I like to be fully prepared. My career, I've never really kind of mapped out what it's going to be. I've been more reactionary than I have been, anything else. Like a lot of the stuff that's happened in my career has just been stuff that's popped up, like the NDE job. I mean, I get a random phone call from a buddy. Hey, I was booked to do Mark Patrick. Mark's not doing his show today. 10 minutes late, within 10 minutes, I've got a tape and an email off to NDE, like stuff like that. It just happens. You can't possibly plan for that. It's just something that popped up and that you have to try to react to. But ultimately, I would like to keep some semblance of this relationship going here, where I have in column A, my job, and then in column B, my freelance stuff and everything that feeds into that, and still having the freedom to do that. I'm not shut off to a return to full-time media should that door open to me at some point. It's just not something that I just can't have all my eggs in that basket, because I think, anybody that does that, you're just going to be left, those eggs are going to end up rotting for a lot of people. It ended up working out for Jake, and good for him. But, if you look back at Jake's 50 years, basically everything in his life has worked out, Jake's way. So you knew that was eventually happening. But PR or communications or something along those lines. I'm loving what we're doing, and we're growing at ISC Sports Network as well. So I'm not saying that like I'm looking at that as a stepping stone. I'm not. I'm very happy with where everything is going. But I just hope 5-10 years from now I can still be active in doing this. I still hope I can attract eyeballs and ears, and people still care what I have to say, or at least entertained by what I have to say, and kind of keep that ball in the air.
I think that will indeed be the case. Derek Schultz, has been great to catch up with you. You're a real pro. I've enjoyed listening and reading your work, and look forward to continuing to do that as well. Best of luck to you and your wife, your young family, and hope you're in the Indianapolis market for many years to come.
Same to you and yours, Gary. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
All right. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast, presented by PNC. It is a weekly conversation with achievers in business, sports, entertainment, and beyond. And you can download all of our episodes, all nearly 90 episodes now, plus get Indiana business news 24/7. All you have to do is go to InsideIndianaBusiness.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Gary Dick. We'll see you next time.